have a special guest on the show this week. I believe the last time that I had a guest on the show was with Carrie Hench. She was from the website tudorsandotherhistories.wordpress.com, and we talked about things in Showtime's The Tudors series that were inaccurate and that bothered us the most. So that was fun. But today's guest is Sari Graham, all the way from Canada.
Whoop, whoop.
Now, you might recognize Sari's name from my Facebook page and my website. She's become a guest quiz creator on tudorsdynasty.com and has created some of the best quizzes for us, some of the most popular ones like the Henry VIII quiz and the Anne Boleyn quiz. And it's been a lot of fun to work more closely with Sari. I mean, not really in proximity, but in mind. We're working closely together. So with that, I'm happy to introduce to you all Sari Graham.
Hi, how are you?
Hello. Thank you so much for coming to the show. I'm really excited to do this with you today.
Thanks for having me. This is really exciting.
Well, with that then, Sari, what is the theme for this episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast?
Well, today we're going to be discussing the Plantagenets and specifically the Wars of the Roses. I think a lot of people who have an interest in Tudors history in general, they've heard of the Wars of the Roses, or alternatively known as the Cousins' Wars, but it's a bit of a gray area for a lot of people. Like, sure, we've heard of it, but we're not really sure how all of those dots connect between the Plantagenets to the Tudors history that we love, and how it connects back to Edward III. So what this is going to be today is basically just connecting those dots and bringing a little bit more clarity to this topic for a lot of people.
All right, let's do this.
So we're going to be talking about the Plantagenets and the ancestry that leads to the rise of the Tudors dynasty. So as Rebecca always says, sit back and relax and allow yourself to be transported back in time as we talk about an exciting, albeit gray area of a really fantastic period of history.
Thank you, Sari. So I'm going to start off just by saying I'm not very well versed in the Plantagenet dynasty. Now, maybe I know enough that's, just to embarrass myself when I'm trying to talk with somebody about it. But really, I'm fascinated by the Wars of the Roses. It's an intriguing part of history. In my mind, when it ties into the Tudors, it ties into the paranoia of Henry VII and maybe Henry VIII. And it's exciting just to see how it all evolved. And of course, I also had an obsession with Elizabeth Woodville and Edward IV and how that all ties in. So I'm really excited to hear what you have to say, Sari, and see if it helps open some more doors for me to want to research a little bit more. So you've put in a lot more research than I have into the Plantagenets in this part of the Reign of Kings. And so I am going to let you just kind of do your thing and teach me a little bit and teach everybody else who's not as familiar.
All right. Well, anybody who has an interest in Tudors history, you've probably heard the term the Wars of the Roses. It's sometimes also referred to as the Cousins' Wars. And, as I stated previously, this can be a really confusing period in history as there's a lot of people involved and there's a lot going on. And what adds to that confusion is most of these people have the same names. So if it wasn't difficult before, let's throw in a bunch of people named Richard and try and figure that out. There's an extensive detail of this period of history, and there's a lot of back and forth and up and down as the wheel of fortune turns for so many people involved here. And pretty much this chunk of history is the lead up to the Tudors dynasty. There would be no Tudors dynasty without the Wars of the Roses. So it was kind of, I guess, in a way, a necessary evil. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about saying that, but it's one of those things that it wasn't great, but it's led up to something that a lot of us love. So yeah, you kind of have to take it for what it is. Ultimately, it led to the union of Henry VII and Elizabeth of York, but we're getting a little ahead of ourselves with regards to what we're going to be talking about today. So I guess the first thing is, who were the Plantagenets? The Plantagenets were actually a very powerful European family originating from Anjou, which is a duchy in France, and it was a prominent fief to the French crown. The word Plantagenet comes from Plantagenista, which is the Latin name for the yellow broom flower. It's actually a really pretty flower if you look it up.
It definitely is.
Yeah, so the yellow broom flower was worn as an emblem by the Counts of Anjou. And in total, the Plantagenets ruled England for 331 years, which is a pretty big dynastic chunk of the monarchy of England. It started with King Henry II in 1154, and it ended with King Richard III in 1485. As I mentioned before, this is where things get a little bit tricky, because we know the name Plantagenet, and it had a lot of meaning to a lot of people, but Plantagenets can be sort of subdivided into 4 parts.
What?
Yep, because like I said, it's not confusing enough. We have to break it down a little bit more.
So there's not just Plantagenets.
Well, they're all Plantagenets, but it's like there's different branches. It's one tree with multiple branches.
Okay, I'll let that.
Really. So there were the Angevins, which were 3 kings of England, Henry II, Richard I, and John.
Okay.
Then there were just, I guess, the general Plantagenets, which were 5 kings, Henry III, Edward I, Edward II, Edward III, and Richard II. And then there was the House of Lancaster, which had 3 kings, Henry IV, Henry V, and Henry VI. And then the House of York, which also had 3 kings, Edward IV, technically Edward V, and Richard III. So all of these rulers are Plantagenet, but not all of them are Angevins, not all of them are Lancaster, not all of them are York, but they're all Plantagenets. You follow me?
No. No, it helps that I have words in front of me to follow along, so I'll make sure when we're done with this to post this as an article too, because that might help people if they want to listen, read it while they're listening. That might help too.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, what does a 30-year-long war have to do with King Edward III? I mean, by this point, King Edward III had already been dead for 78 years, so, I mean, what does that have to do with anything, right? Well, I mean, it doesn't really have anything to do with good old King Ned, but it does involve his children. So let's review here a little bit. Edward III and his wife Philippa of Hainaut had 13 children.
Whoa.
Let that sink in for a second.
That's a lot of babies.
Children, like, God bless this woman.
I can't even imagine.
However, for the sake of expediency, we're actually only focused on 4 of their surviving sons. Lionel of Antwerp, who was the Duke of Clarence, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, and Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester. It was the descendants of these 4 brothers that would spark what we know as the Wars of the Roses. So, diving in, we're going to talk about Lionel here at the beginning. Lionel of Antwerp was the 3rd son of Edward III, but he was the second to survive infancy. As we know, way back then, it was almost more common for babies to die than it was for them to survive. And having 13 children didn't mean a whole lot if 13 of them died. So, sounds like a lot, but ultimately, it doesn't actually produce a lot. So, he was the second to survive infancy after his elder brother, Edward of Woodstock, who is also known as the Black Prince, but that was a nickname that he did not earn during his lifetime.
We're going to have to go back to that name at some point here.
Yeah, for sure. It ties in a little bit later, too. So
okay, perfect.
We're going to come back to that. So Edward, the Black Prince, he actually predeceased his father, the king, in 1376. So Lionel is the 3rd surviving son. Lionel and his first wife, Elizabeth de Burgh, who was the first Countess of Ulster, they had 1 daughter, also named Philippa, who later became the 5th Countess of Ulster in her own right. It's through his daughter Philippa and her descendants that the female line, or at least what I refer to as the female line, of York descends, the House of York. Richard Plantagenet, who was the 3rd Duke of York, gets his claim to the throne via his mother, Anne Mortimer, who was a granddaughter of Philippa, therefore a great-granddaughter of Lionel, and a great-great-granddaughter of King Edward III. So, interestingly enough, Richard Plantagenet, the Duke of York, his claim actually also comes through his father's family. as he was a grandson of Edward III's fourth son, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York. So Richard Plantagenet has, from both sides of his parents, he has strong claims, making him like a double threat. So Richard's father was the third Earl of Cambridge, and he was the second son of Edmund of Langley and his first wife, Isabella of Castile. So Richard inherited the Duchy of York from his uncle, Edward of Norwich, second Duke of York.
Yeah, it's definitely a little bit confusing. If you're not, as you know, I'm only familiar with the major players. And when I say major, for me, that's Edward IV and, Richard III. But this is, wow. Yeah, there's a lot.
It's like their paths to the crown can be, it's not a straight road, and it's not a clear road. It's very foggy until you really dive in and figure out, okay, who's coming from where and why.
Oh, and it's sad because they're all related and they're all fighting for something, but their family fighting over one, prize essentially.
Yeah, the cousins were. It's a very well-named period of history because that's exactly what it was. Like, all of these people were not necessarily first cousins, but they were all related.
And they were killing each other essentially.
Yep.
Ugh.
Okay, so in summation.
On that sad note.
Yeah. Richard Plantagenet, the third Duke of York, had excellent ancestry from both of his parents' families, which is where the Yorks get, in my opinion, a very strong claim to the throne. Through his mother, he was a 3 times great-grandson of King Edward III, and through his father, he was a great-grandson of Edward III. It was this heritage that would be passed along to his son, the future King Edward IV, which would be used as his claim as the first Yorkist king. I think prior to me diving into this, like myself, before we decided to do this podcast together, I didn't really realize what Edward IV's claim was. I just figured, they overthrew Henry VI, and that's that. He's king now.
Right.
I didn't realize he legitimately had a right to do that.
Correct me if I'm wrong, and I hope I'm not, getting ahead of you here. Richard, 3rd Duke of York, at one point, was he named successor to Henry VI?
I think it was talked about.
Okay.
But, again, he's a Yorkist, and the Lancasters had the throne, and they had the throne for quite a while.
Okay.
So it was like possible, but I think with all the movings and politicking, they were like, we can't let that happen.
Okay. I was wondering, because I read so many Philippa Gregory books that I thought maybe it was confusing fact and fiction.
All right. So now we're going to move over to the Lancaster side of things. Let's keep it a little balanced here. I'll talk about the descendants of John of Gaunt, because his descendants also split down 2 lines. John of Gaunt, he's probably the most well-known son of Edward III. Again, it's a name that I think a lot of people have heard, and they're like, oh yeah, John of Gaunt, like, John of Gaunt, like, okay, moving on.
Like, that name is important, but I'm not sure why.
Yeah, exactly. Like, stash that away for a rainy day. We'll figure that out later. So he was the 4th son of Edward III and Philippa of Hainault, but he was the 3rd to survive infancy. There's actually an inordinately large suit of armor that's housed in the Tower of London. I've seen it myself, and it is absolutely monstrous. And the claim is that the suit of armor belonged to John of Gaunt because he himself was a very tall man for the time. But it's actually been disproven that armor was made a very long time after he passed. And I think the armor originated in Germany, so it was not his. As fun as it would be to have something like that tied to John of Gaunt, it's not his armor. He didn't wear it. He wasn't even alive when it was made, so not his. So John of Gaunt, it's through his first and his third wives that the claimants from House of Lancaster descend. John of Gaunt and his first wife, Blanche of Castile, were the parents of King Henry IV. Or Henry Bolingbroke, as he was known prior to his ascension. And he actually overthrew his cousin, King Richard II, in September of 1399. So remember earlier when I mentioned the Black Prince, Edward of Woodstock, predeceasing his father? So Richard II was actually the son of the Black Prince. And because Edward of Woodstock predeceased his father, the king, little 10-year-old Richard II succeeded his grandfather upon the death of Edward III.
Oh, man. And we know how that happened, right?
Oh, yeah. History is ripe with great stories about children coming to the throne, right? So this made John of Gaunt and Blanche of Castile the ancestors of Henry V and Henry VI by their son, Henry IV. So, sounds simple, right? Like, okay, their son, he overthrew his cousin, he's the new king, and then his son and grandson, they also followed. Sounds simple. We're done, right? Nope, we're not done. It's never that easy, my friends. It's through John of Gaunt's third marriage that things get a little bit more complicated. John of Gaunt's third wife, Katherine Swynford, another name that I think a lot of people hear and throw around, but they don't really understand the significance that this woman had in her lifetime and afterwards. She was a fantastically interesting woman, and if you get the chance to read more about her, I would really recommend it, because I have a new respect for Katherine Swynford. She wasn't just another mistress, you know. She was a woman of substance, and she deserves that recognition. But anyways, so Katherine was John's mistress for quite a number of years prior to their marriage. And they had 4 illegitimate children, 3 sons and 1 daughter. Later on in life, Richard II actually legitimized these children, his cousins, when they were adults, long after John and Catherine got married. But later on, they were legitimized, but they were barred from the succession by their half-brother, Henry IV. However, when has a parliamentary statute ever stopped somebody from pursuing the crown? Again, there's plenty of examples in history where it's just like Parliament says no, too bad. I'm going to do what I want.
Exactly. And you know, that whole scenario there, it really intrigues me why Richard II decided to legitimize his cousins at all. You know,
I know, it's a very, you know, as a ruling king, it's a very strange thing for him to do. Why are you creating competition for yourself?
Right.
Really, like, come on. That's what it is. It's interesting. I'm glad he did it. I'm not complaining.
Yeah.
But at the same time, from a practical standpoint, it's like you have to imagine what his counselors must have been saying. Like, no, man, don't do this. Like, it's not going to end well. Don't do it. And he's like, oh, fine. They're my cousins. They're blood. They're good. Right. He's my cousin. It's fine.
It's almost like he was too immature to understand what kind of conflict that was going to cause. I think calling Richard II immature is a very valid way to explain I wanted
the majority of his rule.
Right, I was like, what's the right word that I can use for him?
Useless is another good one.
Useless.
You know?
Spoiled.
I feel it's something that I would have to research more thoroughly myself, but I feel like there's a lot of parallels between the rule of Richard II and his ancestor Edward II. They both come from very powerful, like their fathers, or in Richard's case his grandfather, very powerful men who reigned before them. And then you get these heirs and they're just like, well, whatever.
Right.
So this was my court test and I'm going to play. Like, it's just,
they never took it seriously.
No, and there were serious repercussions for their lack of control. So anyways, we're going to talk about John of Gaunt's first son with Katherine Swynford, also named John. So going forward, I'm just going to say John, and that's referring to the son, and then John of Gaunt will be John of Gaunt, just to keep things a little bit clear.
Okay.
So John Beaufort was the first Marquess of Somerset, and he became the first Earl of Somerset, and he was the eldest of the 4 children between John of Gaunt and Katherine Swynford. He and his siblings took the name of Beaufort, probably because John of Gaunt had a lordship of the area of Beaufort in Champagne, France. So, I mean, is Beaufort ringing any bells for you? Sounding a little familiar?
It does to me.
It would, because it's John's granddaughter, Margaret Beaufort, Countess of Richmond and Derby, who passed her claim to the throne on to her son, Henry Tudor.
Ooh, and the scandal begins.
It does. The plot thickens.
Right.
So this lineage gives Henry Tudor his claim, and it makes him a 2 times great-grandson of John of Gaunt, and therefore a 3 times great-grandson of King Edward III. However, the problem with his claim is that it was often met with criticism because it was viewed as coming from the illegitimate line, despite the fact that the Beaufort children had been legitimized not only by Richard II in Parliament, but also by Pope Boniface IX in 1396. However, people, back then, claims of the throne, legitimate, not legitimate, whatever. It's like a dog with a bone. They won't let it go. We're going to keep hearing about this. It's going to keep coming up.
And I suppose the biggest part of the argument is the Henry IV part. He said that they couldn't be part of the succession, correct?
Yeah, because they were his half-siblings. And so he acknowledged their legitimacy, but he still kind of kept that dark cloud over them, saying like, well, you're technically legitimate, but not legitimate enough for it to matter. So, that being said, now let's focus on Thomas of Woodstock, Duke of Gloucester, who was the 4th son. His descendants, again, get their claim mostly through, again, what I refer to as the female line, because it involves his daughter, not directly through sons. Because it's coming through a female line, again, it's met with criticism, and that's not a valid claim. Women can't rule. They're weak. They can't handle power, blah, 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 all of that. So we're still in a period of rule of Richard II. And in 1397, Thomas of Woodstock, who was the uncle of Richard II, was attainted as a traitor, as the leader of the Lords Appellant, which was a group of men, nobles, who sought to impeach some of the king's favorites in order to curb what they felt was tyrannical and reckless rule. Again, a parallel with Edward II, because Edward II's wife and her lover did the same thing. You're not ruling properly. You're not looking after your barons. You're not looking after England, and we're going to do something about it. Something needs to be done. On behalf of King Richard II, Thomas de Mowbray, who was the first Duke of Norfolk, actually murdered the uncle of the king. Like, can you imagine?
What?
How would that even fly? Like, you've murdered the uncle of the king. You'd think you'd get your butt thrown into the tower, but instead you've done the king a great favor.
Well, I never knew that. I never knew that piece of history. Interesting.
Yeah, it wasn't a nice death.
Well, okay. Now I'm gonna have to do some research.
Yeah. So it was through Thomas's daughter Anne. She actually married into the powerful Stafford family.
Oh, I know that name.
So it's through that line that Thomas's descendants get their claim. Anne's son, Humphrey Stafford, was created the Duke of Buckingham in 1444. And due to the fact of his mother's ancestry, it actually gave him royal blood as a cousin to King Henry the Sixth. So Humphrey Stafford married Lady Anne Neville, but not that Anne Neville.
Okay.
Anne Neville.
I was like, wait a minute, like Queen Anne? Okay.
Yeah, not that same Anne Neville. And the interesting thing here is that Anne Neville herself was the daughter of Joan Beaufort, which again comes right back to John of Gaunt. So, are you still with me here?
I'm following.
So, Humphrey Stafford was succeeded by his son, another Henry, in 1460 as the second Duke of Buckingham. His wife, so Henry Stafford's wife, was the Lady Catherine Woodville.
Oh, okay.
Sister to Edward IV's Queen Elizabeth.
Yes, and he was mad about having to marry her.
Oh, yeah. So it was this Henry who was actually implicated in the disappearance and likely murder of the princes in the Tower in the summer of 1483.
Okay.
King Richard III later had Henry Stafford executed on the 2nd of November in 1483 for his role in, Buckingham's rebellion. Henry's young... So,
you must be pretty important to get your own rebellion.
yeah. That rebellion also implicated Elizabeth Woodville and Margaret Beaufort. They were all working together to get rid of Richard.
Oh, okay. Now this sounds a little bit more familiar to me.
Yeah.
Okay,
But Henry
gotcha.
was the one who lost his head for it. I mean,
Yes.
I think Margaret was attainted, and she lost her titles there for a brief period of time.
Yeah, I think her husband got all of her land and stuff instead.
Yeah.
Okay.
And Stanley didn't, he was like, oh, I'm still going to remain neutral. I'm not going to do anything with this.
These Buckinghams had a way of losing their head, didn't they?
Oh, yeah, and we'll touch on that again in a minute.
Okay. Oops, sorry.
That's okay. So after the execution of Henry Stafford, he actually left a young son named Edward. And it's said that Edward, he was, I think, a young child. He was hidden away with various friends or relatives, keeping him away from King Richard III. Because, I mean, if Richard III has taught us anything, is that he's not really against getting rid of children who stand in the way. Take that for what it's worth. But after the victory of Henry Tudor at Bosworth, he made Edward Stafford a Knight of the Order of the Bath as the Duke of Buckingham in 1485. So, you'd think, okay, well, his father was attainted as a traitor and was executed. So when you have an attainder against you, you lose all your titles, you lose your land and your money and everything that you own. But Henry Tudor actually had that reversed for Edward. And so Edward Stafford became the third Duke of Buckingham in November of 1485. Anybody who watched this series, The Tudors, will know who Edward Stafford is. He was in the first 2 episodes of the first season. I think in the show it was portrayed that his daughter was caught hanging out with Charles Brandon.
That was a nice way to put it. Hanging out.
Spending a little too much personal time with Charles Brandon. But that's a bit of an error, liberty in place of the show.
All right.
But anyways, if you're going to if you want to put a face to the name, I guess use that example. That's who he was.
The blonde-haired guy.
Yes, and he was very, very fiery and had a lot to say.
Arrogant.
Yes. Typical Stafford.
Yes.
So he became the third Duke of Buckingham.
Okay.
And he also had great lineage, like Richard Plantagenet did, because he got it from both sides, not from both of his parents, but his father. Both of his father's parents had that dual line. He was a 3 times great-grandson of Edward III through both Thomas of Woodstock and through John of Gaunt. His father was a descendant through Anne Neville, who was the granddaughter of John of Gaunt, and then his father's father was a grandson of Thomas of Woodstock. So it's sort of due to this ancestry, as well as him having a penchant for rebellion and treason. King Henry VIII had really no problem in ordering his execution in 1521 and snuffing out this vein of Plantagenet blood that we know that Henry VIII was worried about and that Henry VII was definitely worried.
Yeah.
So.
Well, even later when it came to Reginald Pole, too, even then he was still after that Plantagenet blood.
Yep. Yeah. And I mean, Reginald Pole had the blood.
Well, definitely.
He had a legitimate claim, I suppose, aside from him being in the church.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it was definitely on the radar of Henry VIII and Henry VII that there are Plantagenets out there and that this could be a problem. It's interesting too, because the execution of Edward Stafford, we know that Henry VIII later in life kind of went on an execution spree, so to say. He had a lot of people executed for a lot of not good reasons, but Edward Stafford, it's been said that it was probably the only execution that Henry VIII ordered that was on good grounds. There was good reason to condemn him, and he was guilty of plotting the king's death and talking about the king's death, and he did do it, whereas that kind of suggests that a lot of the other ones really died needlessly.
Yeah. And really at the beginning of Henry VIII's reign, I mean, didn't execute as many people from 1509 till when was Buckingham executed? 1521 or 22?
Yeah. 1521.
So he had Edmund and Dudley right away after he came to the throne in about 1510. And then he had Edmund de la Pole in like 1513. Mm-hmm. And then I think there was a long break before the third Duke of Buckingham was executed.
Yeah, because things had kind of settled down, and I think I know in this show, The Tudors, again, it portrays Edward's daughter as having a relationship with Charles Brandon, so that didn't happen. But I think there was a snub somewhere where somebody was involved with a sister or niece.
Yes, it was his sister. The third Duke of Buckingham his sister was accused of being a mistress to Henry VIII. And it got found out, and she got sent away to a nunnery, I think.
Yeah. And then wasn't she pulled out of the nunnery, or am I thinking of something else?
Oh, I don't really. It's been a while since I read that. I think that's what I did my first Tudor Summit on. It was one of the scandals of Tudor court, and that was one of the stories, and I wish I could remember how it all... I just remember, of course... She got sent away, and her husband was embarrassed, and I think he left court for a while too. And
and it's funny, like when we say like how scandalous the Tudor courts were, and it's really like the scandal. Sure, somebody sleeping with somebody else's wife, that's scandal worthy, but I think the Tudors themselves kind of court scandal just because of the nature of the dynasty and how they came to the throne. You know, surrounded by Plantagenet blood. Like, do you really think that this is going to be calm and smooth sailing? Like, something's going to happen. Someone's going to blink, and something is going to happen. And so I think for people to view certain things within the Tudor court, whether it's Henry VII, Henry VIII, Edward, Mary, Elizabeth, whatever, it's like, well, that's kind of what it's about.
Yeah.
It wouldn't be so fascinating if it was just like, okay, well, the king died and his son succeeded him, and then he died, so his sister succeeded him, and then everybody lived happily ever after. Like, without the scandal, we don't have the interesting aspects of this history.
That's
and
so
while
true.
I'm sure it was not nice for the contemporaries living it at the time, it's the icing on the cake for us now.
I agree. That's why we're all so fascinated by it. There's just so much to be and just when I think that I have a good grasp of what I enjoy the most about the Tudors or the Plantagenets, that's when something else will come along and change my mind and go, oh wait, now I'm obsessed with this.
Yeah, that's kind of how my interest in all of this started. I was a child when I first had a taste of the Tudors. My first introduction to it was Princess Elizabeth, or later Elizabeth I. I think I was only about 12 years old. And then it was just a ripple effect from there. Like, I would study it. I remember I had a book of Elizabeth I, like when she was a child. And in the back, it gave you some historical information, and Henry VI and his 6 wives. Like, oh my God, he had 6 wives? That's crazy. And it was actually a teacher at school who taught me the rhyme of divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. And I was like, wait, what? Like, this is crazy. And so I just kept reading about anything I could find about Elizabeth, Princess Elizabeth, Elizabeth Tudor, whatever. I kind of just went nuts for it. And I think I was 13 years old when I read my first book by David Starkey.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So... And it was just ripples in the pond from there. Like, okay, so this is pretty interesting, but like, let's find out more about those 6 wives of her father. So now we're in the next ring here, and we're going to learn about this. Okay, well, you know, why was Anne Boleyn executed, or why was Anne of Cleves divorced? Like, let's just branch out here. Like, it's just ripples in a pond for me. Like, I focus on one part, and then I keep expanding on it so that I can tie it all back together.
Right. Yeah. It's so fun. I just, the history. So I know, I posted on, it might have been Instagram today, a picture of a map that I just bought.
Yes.
And I think I showed it to you.
Yes.
And I sat here yesterday with it sprawled out on my kitchen table, looking at the map with the buildings along the Thames and trying to figure out, how far it would have been for somebody to travel from one location to another. And would they have gone by horse or would it have been quicker to go by river? And to be able to look at it on a map really gave me a whole new insight to what London looked like in 1520.
Yes.
And I can imagine, even what it was like through the end of Queen Elizabeth's reign, but just to have that tangible map in front of me to look at it, it blew my mind. So now I'm obsessed with maps.
Yeah, it's really, I like that. Like I would find that interesting too. I remember I was reading something about, like up north in York. I think it was the Kingmaker. I was reading about the Kingmaker, Duke of Warwick. And I Google mapped York to London. And then I clicked the walking option because there's no by horseback option.
Right. I do
Google
that
Maps.
too.
And I remember just going oh my God, if I was a queen consort at the time, or even a queen regnant, whatever, I would never go on Progress. Never.
Right.
I'm not doing
long
this.
Ride.
No, I'm not doing this. Oh my gosh, that distance on horseback or in a carriage.
Yeah.
No, thank you.
Can you imagine? They'd have to have a lot of cushions in there for the king or the queen. It just seems awful. It just seems miserable.
So back to our original discussion here. I mean, based on everything that we've said, it seems that everybody had a blood claim to the throne of England.
Yeah.
The question is really whose claim was the strongest? And, I'm not speaking in definite terms here. I'm just this is my opinion, but I think the Yorks had it simply because Richard Plantagenet was a great grandson of Edward III through his father. And that made him the closest related male line descendant. And it was the marriage of his granddaughter, Elizabeth of York, to Henry Tudor that really cemented all of that. It cemented Henry Tudor's claim because a lot of people felt that his was invalid because of the non-legitimacy thing. And Elizabeth of York being the eldest child of Edward IV. And for a while there, a lot of people felt that the throne should have gone to her because her brothers disappeared. It kind of brings it all together at the end where... It ended. It was the union of the houses of York and Lancaster, and that's where the Tudor rose, the red rose and the white rose together, brings it all together. And at the end of the day, it's okay, well, we've got two sides here, technically two enemy sides, Lancaster and York. Everybody has strong claims, and that's great. But we're going to finish this now, and going forward, their descendants had both claims from both royal families, or royal houses, rather.
And then it's crazy to think that combination of Lancaster and York created Henry VIII. Yeah.
And then he kind of, goes back in time a little bit and starts, killing people off just because of a blood claim that goes back, other than Edward Stafford. I don't think anybody else was really bothered by it. I think the de la Poles kind of got involved after he started going after people. If he had just left well enough alone, I think things might have been a little different. That's not to say I don't think he would have encountered problems from the Plantagenet side of things, but he wouldn't be viewed so negatively as he is if he had just kind of accepted that he has, distant related cousins, and it is what it is. I mean, that's what they had to do decades before him. Do you think Henry V sat on the throne, plotting the murder of his cousins just because they're also Plantagenets?
Yeah, that's what always makes me think that it's the Wars of the Roses, that history being so close to him that made him become so paranoid when it came to legitimate heirs to the throne.
Yeah, and I mean there were it wasn't just a back and forth of I'm the king, no, I'm the king. There were battles. This was a civil war. There were battles fought. People did die. People were executed without cause.
Right.
You, Richard III. So I mean, it was a civil war. again, I guess maybe you might be able to parallel that against, going way, way back to the Empress Matilda and King Stephen. This is a civil war between cousins. Again,
Right.
first cousins. Civil war. Parts of England favored Stephen. Parts of England favored Matilda. And it was the same thing with the Wars of the Roses, except I think with the Wars of the Roses, there were many more incidences of people arbitrarily changing sides when that wheel of fortune turned and suddenly the Lancasters are on the bottom and the Yorks are on the top. Okay, well, maybe we should switch sides.
Yeah.
Looking at you, Stanley family.
Yeah, exactly. They were notorious for that.
So it's like it just repeats itself. Like, again, the wheel just keeps spinning and the same problems keep coming up and going away and keep coming up and going away. And
People
so it's really interesting that, like, the parallels.
I always feel like people don't learn from history. We're so often told that history repeats itself, but yet we still end up becoming part of history, even though we knew it was coming.
Yep.
These guys should have known that this was okay. Just recently there was a lot of infighting, so
yeah.
I love that. Well, thank you so much, Sari, for going over all of this, because I know the everything after Edward III can be very confusing.
Yeah.
Now we know, that it was split up basically between his 4 sons, and the descendants of those 4 sons are the ones that essentially started the Wars of the Roses. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay.
That's pretty much Edward III's grandchildren and great-grandchildren. It was those 2 generations that really things seem to pick up. I mean, Edward III's 4 sons, as far as I understand it, there weren't any major beefs between those 4 men. Like, it wasn't, John of Gaunt raising an army going against Lionel of Antwerp. Like, that just didn't happen. It was 78 years after the fact.
Right.
That stuff really kind of started to get a little hairy there.
Well, thank you so much for filling us all in and teaching me today, so that I understand it a little bit better, because it is confusing. So thank you for all the research you put into it.
Yeah, no problem. I mean, I enjoyed it too, and I'm a forever student. I will always look for ways to learn. And I mean, it was just maybe 10 days ago that I realized what the difference was between the Angevins and Plantagenets.
Right.
Like, I knew that they were connected, but I didn't realize that, the Angevins were Plantagenets, but not all Plantagenets were Angevins. That just has to go with the Duchy of Anjou. And after that was lost, looking at you, King John, they were no longer Angevin kings of England. They were just Plantagenet kings of England.
So the moral of the story is keep reading.
Always keep reading. Ask questions. If you're not sure, keep looking it up. Find more sources. If you find something that contradicts, research both sides. If something says this happened, but then another source says no, this happened instead, research both and form your own opinion. Don't just regurgitate what Wikipedia tells you. Right. Don't just regurgitate something you read in a certain historical fiction genre of books by a certain author.
That wasn't a strong hint.
It's so much. There's so much there, and it's just, I don't know. Like, I would be happy researching this stuff in my spare time, like, just because, like, it's entertaining to me. It's nourishing to me, and I like to learn. Yeah. And then I like to talk about things that I'm passionate about. So doing this was really exciting, and I would love to do it again with you.
Well, thank you so much, Sari, for joining me today, and hopefully we'll do this again in the future.
Yes, for sure. Thanks so much for having me.